In the 1920s and 1930s, life in Mobile, Alabama, unfolded at a slower, more relaxed pace. Sid Phillips grew up on Georgia Avenue in Midtown, a neighborhood lined with shady trees where families knew one another well. Only a few blocks away on Montauk Avenue lived another young boy who would become one of the most significant people in Sid's life, Eugene Sledge. The two first became friends in grade school, sharing classrooms, playgrounds, and all the ordinary moments that shaped childhood. Eugene's early years, however, were interrupted by serious illness. While still a boy, he contracted rheumatic fever, leaving him confined for nearly 2 years. Eugene's father was widely recognized throughout Mobile as the city's heart specialist, a physician whose work would now be described as cardiology. At that time, few doctors focused on that field, and his reputation reached far beyond the local community. During Eugene's long recovery, the other neighborhood boys continued with school and everyday life, but Sid remained a loyal friend and never drifted away. The friendship they built during those difficult years only became stronger. Before long, the Sledge family moved into an impressive residence on Spring Hill Avenue, known as Georgia Cottage. The home had once belonged to Augusta Evans Wilson, the celebrated Civil War-era novelist whose many books had earned international recognition as well as fame across the United States. Wilson had enjoyed considerable wealth, and her home reflected that success. Rather than modernize it after purchasing the property, the Sledge family chose to preserve its historic character, filling its rooms with antique furnishings that maintained the atmosphere of an earlier era. Growing up there gave Eugene the feeling of living in a place where the past was still very much alive. The estate itself contained several old outbuildings dating back to before the Civil War, including the remains of former slave quarters. There were horse stables, kennels for hunting dogs, and extensive grounds stretching across roughly 40 acres until they reached a winding creek in the distance. To Sid and the other boys, the Sledge property felt like a paradise. Sid later remembered that a close group of 5 or 6 friends spent nearly all their time together during those years. They shared many interests, but none captured their imagination more than American history, especially the Civil War. Mobile's rich historical heritage, along with the nearby battlefields, gave them endless opportunities to explore their fascination. On weekends and throughout the long summer months, the boys would ride their bicycles across the bay into Baldwin County, where 2 major Civil War battlefields remained largely untouched by modern development. Traffic was so light that 4 boys could comfortably ride side by side along the narrow 2-lane roads, sometimes seeing only 2 or 3 automobiles during the entire trip. Once they arrived, they wandered across ground that appeared almost unchanged since the fighting had ended decades earlier. Pine forests still covered much of the landscape, while cattle grazed peacefully over fields where soldiers had once fought fierce battles. Without the benefit of metal detectors or other modern equipment, the boys searched carefully with nothing more than their eyes and hands. Time after time, they uncovered bullets, fragments of cannonballs, and other relics scattered across the old battlefields. To them, these finds represented much more than simple keepsakes. Each object brought history to life in a way books never could. They knew exactly which regiments had occupied particular positions, where attacks had been launched, and where battle lines had finally collapsed. Every relic became another piece of the larger story they had come to know so well, making them feel as though they were stepping directly into the past. Their adventures extended beyond searching for artifacts. Not far from the battlefields ran a cool, clear creek where they escaped the summer heat by swimming for hours. As evening arrived, they often camped beside the water, wrapping themselves in blankets beneath the night sky and talking long after dark until sleep finally overtook them. Days spent relic hunting, cycling, swimming, and camping created lasting memories, while the friendship between Sid and Eugene continued to grow stronger. Life at Georgia Cottage offered still more opportunities for adventure. Eugene's father eventually bought him an old model roadster equipped with a rumble seat. Although it was far from new, to the boys it symbolized freedom. Eugene supplied both the car and the gasoline, and because he alone had a driver's license, he naturally took the wheel every time they set out. Together they explored Alabama's country roads, enjoying the independence that came with driving wherever they pleased. Looking back, Sid remembered those years in Mobile as some of the happiest of his life, filled with friendship, laughter, and constant discovery. Although Eugene was actually 2 years older than Sid, the difference in age mattered very little. Because rheumatic fever had forced Eugene to miss so much school, Sid graduated in 1941 while Eugene finished a year later. Ordinarily, even a single year's difference in school could separate friends. But living so close together and sharing nearly every adventure erased that distinction. Their friendship also became closely connected with Sid's future family. During high school, Eugene dated the young woman who would later become Sid's wife. She was well known, admired by many, and popular among the local boys. Years afterward, Eugene served as Sid's best man, a role that reflected not only their lifelong friendship, but also the deep affection and respect they held for one another. After the war, when Sid was married and Eugene remained single, the two friends still spent countless evenings together. Their conversations often lasted well into the early hours of the morning. More than once, Mary's patience would wear thin, and around 2 o'clock she would finally interrupt, insisting that Eugene head home. He would simply laugh, affectionately call her Miss Mary, promise to visit again soon, and leave with a smile. While their youth was filled with adventure, the growing crisis overseas was never entirely absent from their thoughts. Events unfolding across Europe dominated newspaper headlines and everyday conversations. Sid followed developments with particular interest because he had cousins living in England, and his father regularly exchanged letters with relatives there. The boys understood that Britain was fighting for its survival, and that the Royal Air Force faced relentless attacks day after day. Like many Americans, they believed it was probably only a matter of time before the United States would become involved in the war, just as it had during the First World War. That expectation became reality on December 7, 1941. That afternoon, Sid was enjoying a vanilla milkshake at a drugstore located at the corner of Dolphin and Ann Street with his friend W.O. Brown. Although W.O. was 1 year behind Sid in school, the two were close companions. Without warning, a woman rushed through the front door, urgently calling for someone to switch on the radio. Behind the soda fountain, an employee quickly turned it on, and every station carried the same astonishing bulletin. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. There were perhaps 15 people inside the store, and a stunned silence quickly settled over the room. Most had never even heard of Pearl Harbor before that day. Sid, however, immediately understood the significance of the announcement. He had 2 uncles serving in the Navy, one of whom had previously been stationed at Luke Field in Hawaii, so he knew exactly where Pearl Harbor was located. When he explained this to those gathered inside, it gave him a brief feeling of importance amid the confusion. Details of the attack remained incomplete, but early reports mentioned heavy casualties, and as the news continued, several women in the drugstore began to cry. Throughout the announcement, W.O., who worked there as a soda jerk, quietly continued wiping the marble counter in slow, steady circles. Finally, he looked over at Sid and said, "Sid, let's join the Navy tomorrow." Sid did not hesitate. "All right," he replied. The next morning they met at Bienville Square in downtown Mobile, where the large fountain in the center made it an easy place to find one another. From there, they walked together to the Federal Building, where military recruiting offices were located. The sight that greeted them was completely unexpected. The Navy recruiting line already stretched nearly 200 yards down St. Joseph Street, wrapped around the corner, and continued along St. Louis Street. Even though it was only 8 o'clock in the morning, hundreds of young men had arrived ahead of them. The Marine Corps office, by comparison, was almost deserted. As Sid and W.O. stood looking at the long Navy line, a Marine sergeant approached them. "Do you boys want to kill Japanese?" he asked. Both answered yes, though they explained that they had planned to enlist in the Navy. The sergeant smiled and joked that they had no chance of getting into the Navy because their parents were married, one of the many playful jabs exchanged between the different military branches. He continued making his case, describing Marine training near sandy beaches and beautiful coastlines, painting an appealing picture of life in the Corps. His sales pitch proved convincing. Curious enough to hear more, the two friends stepped inside the Marine recruiting office. Because neither of them had yet reached legal enlistment age, they needed written permission from their parents. Convincing their families took several days, but eventually both secured the necessary signatures. On December 26, they returned to the recruiting station carrying the completed paperwork. 4 days later, they boarded a train bound for Birmingham, where they officially took the oath of enlistment. Roughly 50 new recruits gathered there. Among them was Wes Tatum, who quickly became one of Sid's closest friends. On December 31, 1941, Sid, Tatum, and the rest of their group arrived at Parris Island. They formed the final platoon to report that year, stepping off 5 packed railroad cars. Looking back, Sid believed the arrivals had been carefully scheduled, so that each group reached the base in manageable numbers without overwhelming the training staff. Sid's father had served in the Argonne campaign during the First World War and had initially been reluctant to give his consent. In time, however, he came to believe that joining the Marine Corps offered his son the greatest chance of surviving the war. Sid later remembered his father explaining that Marines were renowned for their discipline, exceptional marksmanship, and professionalism. Even their German opponents in the previous war had respected them. Believing that such demanding training would prepare his son better than anything else, he finally signed the enlistment papers. Parris Island proved every bit as difficult as the young recruits had imagined, and perhaps even more so. Sid later described boot camp as a carefully engineered nightmare, designed to strip away old habits before rebuilding recruits into Marines. The drill instructors were relentless in their demands. They shouted constantly, expected perfection, and tolerated no excuses, but their harshness always served a purpose rather than simple cruelty. The lesson was straightforward: learn to do everything exactly as instructed, and the pressure would eventually ease. Week by week, Sid watched his platoon change. Individual recruits gradually disappeared into a disciplined unit, where every movement was synchronized and every task carried out as one. His platoon, number 277, never received the traditional graduation photograph. On the scheduled day, torrential rain flooded the parade grounds, and there was no building large enough to accommodate everyone indoors. Years later, Sid still regretted that no official roster had been preserved. Of all the men in the platoon, only W.O. Brown and Wes Tatum remained firmly in his memory. Following boot camp, the Marines were transferred to Camp Lejeune, then commonly known as New River. There, assignments were handed out by the sergeants. Determined to stay together, Sid, W.O., and Tatum managed to secure places in the same unit. Given a choice between serving with machine guns or mortars, they selected the mortar platoon, believing it suited them better while allowing them to remain side by side. Tatum, who was 5 years older than Sid, earned a reputation as dependable and level-headed, although promotions came slowly. Advancement was often influenced by geography and personal connections, with many officers favoring men from their own home states. Sid noticed that his own lieutenant, a Massachusetts native, seemed naturally inclined toward recruits from New England. Their platoon commander, known simply as Benny, had previously served as a sergeant. With the Marine Corps rapidly expanding after America's entry into the war, experienced enlisted men were promoted to officer rank with remarkable speed. Although Benny had completed only a single semester of teachers' college, he possessed 6 years of military experience, including service in the Philippines. His heavily tattooed arms made him instantly recognizable, but it was his competence and steady leadership that earned the respect of the men under his command. For Sid Phillips, the journey from the quiet streets of Mobile to the demanding training grounds of Parris Island and Camp Lejeune had happened with remarkable speed. The carefree days spent searching Civil War battlefields, swimming in creeks, and exploring Alabama's backroads now belonged to the past. In their place stood the disciplined life of a United States Marine, preparing for a war in the Pacific that would soon test every lesson he had learned. I hope you enjoyed the story of Sidney Phillips and his pre-war life. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe. If you want to add to the discussion, feel free to leave a comment.